Hello and welcome to an ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a frontline update for the 3rd of January 2023. Quite a bit of news to get through before the front line, so let's get to it. What has happened sort of overnight? Well, we'll go first to the figures released by the Ukrainians for the Russian losses, caveat propaganda, caveat inaccurate, caveat indicative, caveat Russians don't produce the same sort of figures. Anyway, 750 personnel liquidated, so the Ukrainians claim. So slightly higher number than I guessed over the previous week. 5 tanks, 7 APC, so that's pretty useful numbers, as well as 6 artillery systems and 1 MLRS. So fairly decent equipment losses, I guess, for the Ukrainians. One anti-aircraft warfare system, that's going to be useful, and 1 helicopter. 3 drones, 10 vehicles and fuel tanks. Don't underestimate the usefulness of taking out fuel tanks, but it does depend. I mean, those 10 could be technicals. It could be any sort of vehicle, I guess. So that's pretty decent figures for Russian losses for the Ukrainians, I guess. Here, I'm trying to work out whether there were drone strikes last night. So no reports here says Russia launched 27 Shahed 136 kamikaze drones in Ukraine. All drones were shot down by air defense forces, but I can't see that many other places. But he has got the 3 Orlan 10 reconnaissance drone and the 1 Ka-52 attack helicopter, which we've just seen in those figures. But speaking about drones, nights are not going to be calm in Ukraine within the next few weeks, says Zelensky. Russian massive drone attacks on Ukraine may last for a long time to exhaust Ukrainian air defense and civilians. President Zelensky warns based on the data of Ukraine's intelligence. And here is mainstream media reporting that Russia is planning a protracted campaign of attacks with Iranian drones to exhaust Ukraine, President Zelensky warned in his Monday night address. Quote, it is probably banking on exhaustion, exhausting our people, our anti-aircraft defenses, our energy. Now, this is probably quite a good um, tactic from the Russians here, because the air defense systems that have been taking down these drones, because they've been at night predominantly, have been less the Gepard ones that we saw quite effective when you had early morning drone attacks. In the night, there it appears that the missile systems are kicked into action. Now, if they are going to send over wave and wave after wave and wave of cheap drones, and it's the Nazams and the Iris Ts that are going to take out those drones, then actually that could be quite a good tactic, because if you exhaust the ammunition for those and then send over a saturation wave of cruise missiles, it might be that those systems have exhausted their missiles and are waiting for more ammunition from Western sources, so on and so forth. So that could be a good tactic for the Russians, and Zelensky and Ukrainian intelligence recognize this, and hence what he's saying there. Um, moving on, according to the Ukrainian Stratcom, the Russians lost a big ammo storage in Svatova, losing 2 weeks of accumulated ammo. Why would you even do that within HIMARS range? Asks Defmon. Good question. And that could have a negative effect on Russian maneuvering potential in the area. So 2 weeks worth of ammo. Now, that's a bit of a vague claim. 2 weeks of ammo, what, for one cannon, for one howitzer, for all the howitzers in the area, for what? It'd be nice if that was more exact, more precise. But the general point here is that's a big loss for the Russian forces in the area, no doubt. 2 weeks worth of ammo. And a big dump getting hit by HIMARS. HIMARS have been active, and indeed, Ukrainian HIMARS have attacked Chulukova in the Kherson region, and an estimated 500 Russian soldiers were killed and wounded, reports Ukraine's general staff. This is right on the back of the Makivka. In fact, this happened, I believe, on the 31st of December, but the news is just coming through now. So, on the back of the news from Makivka, this is another massive hit for the Russians. Wow, just a huge numbers. Where is that, you ask? Well, it's just down here, south of Holopristan, south of Kherson city, across the river, of course. So that is potentially a massive hit for the Ukrainians if up to 500 killed and wounded is anywhere near true. As well as that, Ukrainian strike drones have been active again. They were claimed to have been shot down over Simferopol and Sevastopol. Um, but whether they found their targets, I don't know. Given all the holes blown in Russian air defenses by PSU launched AGM 88 harm missiles. So these are anti-radar missiles that take out air defense installations and radar installations. And Ukrainian HIMARS launched GIMLRS strikes. This will happen at an increasing rate. So the point here is that the Ukrainians have arguably paved the way for more drone strikes by taking out in a targeted manner radar installations, so that these perhaps can get through. We might see an increased rate of Ukrainian drones being used, and this talks to the importance of Ukrainian manufactured drones. So you're starting to see shells now being manufactured for the 152 millimeter howitzers, the old Soviet era ones, being sent to the front lines and getting there. So the first Ukrainian manufactured shells, which is massively important. And we might well be seeing an increased usage of Ukrainian manufactured drones to do these kind of strikes. That said, this is interesting news. Ukroboronprom executive. So this is one of the main defense manufacturers in Ukraine. Executives charged for supplying low quality equipment to the army. Ukraine's Economic Security Bureau, reported on January 2nd that it charged 6 executives of Ukroboronprom, the country's main defense company, with embezzlement and abuse of power. So that's that. Keep an eye on this. That could be an interesting story. And of course, corruption is a problem in Ukraine, as it is in many places. But Ukraine has suffered historically, and it is something that many there seek to stamp out. J- is it a waste of time answering bots and shills? Probably, but I do love it when they're so obviously wrong. So this is Nikos G on my threads yesterday. An enormous explosion in Druzhkovka tonight caught live on French TV channel. A successful missile strike was delivered at the temporary location of the armed forces of Ukraine in Druzhkovka. But of course, you will not hear from the West media. This happens every day with many of Ukrainian brothers' losses. So, the media just won't report it. And of course, it's everywhere. It's all over Twitter, um, and the socials. And look, Reuters, one of the main news sources in the world. Eastern Ukrainian ice arena destroyed in Russian attack. Hockey Federation says. So this is some pretty remarkable footage, I have to say. Let's just show you. This is live on French TV. With apparently a million French people watching live. We'll see that again. It's on the Quotidien. Show. So there you go. Hoping that his reporter there is okay. And then, here's the damage afterwards.
Мужики, пластик сливает. Переходи через парапет, давай на...
So on and so forth. Now, that is at an ice hockey arena. Apparently, some people are saying in Druzhkovka. Here, no report says it's in Kramatorsk. But by the by, the Ukrainians have officially said that there were 2 injured, I believe. Yeah. So President's office, Russia injures 2 in Druzhkovka, Donetsk Oblast. 2 people were injured in Russia's missile attack against the city of Druzhkovka in eastern Donetsk Oblast. The deputy head of the president's office reported. Whether there were more, whether that was a troop accumulation in the ice hockey arena, I don't know. I don't know the details yet, but I'm sure that will come out. there you go. It has been reported at least. So Nicholas G, just what's the word? Oh yeah, that's it. Wrong, just really wrong. Anyway, let's go on to the front lines. So let's go to our northeastern sector first. That's Kupiansk down to Svatiove-Kreminna. This is what it looks on my map here. We've got Kupiansk, or just northeast of Kupiansk, down to Svatiove, and then down to Kreminna there. Okay, so as we focus in on the northern part of this, there is activity around Vilshana coming down, but not a lot. There's actually not a great amount of news again out of this whole front line, particularly, especially as we go further south, interestingly, nearer Kreminna. No report says again, fighting was reported near Orlianska. So this is just south of Persho-Travnevi here. Orlianska there, which is around the Yahidna area, and Kislivka. There's repelled attacks around Kislivka. As they say, Ukrainian repelled attacks around Stelimakivka and Kislivka. A big Russian ammo warehouse in Svatovo was destroyed yesterday after a HIMARS attack. That's what Defmon said. Suryak, which is a pro-Russian mapper, says that reports about Novosibirsk falling or being liberated by the Ukrainians in the last days is they reckon is untrue. There's some Russian footholds in a hangar area, as according to them. I'm not 100% sure. I'd go along with that. There seems to be quite a lot of claims that the Russians were kicked out of Novosibirsk, but who knows? It's been a bit back and forth there. That is here, Novosibirsk, and just to the west of Kuzmivka, and that's to the northwest of Svatova. Okay, but really not a lot of news coming out of anywhere around here. What does Rebar say? Oh, well, we'll go on to Defmon, another pro-Ukrainian source, saying there was actually, before we get to the Kreminna front, he says Svatova, the Ukrainians repulsed an attack around Stelimakivka again. This section of the front is almost at a standstill. The Ukrainians are, however, making incremental gains despite heavy Russian counterattacks. So he says the Russians are really counterattacking quite a lot around Svatova, but the Ukrainians are making some gains. It is heavy. Perhaps around there. The news is that the grounds are due to freeze over next week as the weather gets a lot colder. This is what Rebar's map looks like. And it's interesting because there's quite a large area, according to them, of grey zone just to the south of Vilshana. And there is activity around Brestova and Vilshana here, which is around near the Kuzmivka area. But you can see for them, the grey zone is much larger than I've given it on my map. So if you think there's Kuzmivka, there'll be Novosibirsk. Their grey zone reaches to the west of Novosibirsk and also to Bivka here. So let's show you where their grey zone would be. Their grey zone would be all the way back here, all the way back here, so on and so forth. So for them, they've just got a larger, they're more generous to the Russians. Arguably, I could be more generous to the Ukrainians. But as we go further, well, let's just talk about the Kupiansk sector from Rebar. From what they say, just that the Ukrainians are sending out scouting Russian positions with drones and forward scouts near Vilshana, Pervomaisky, and Kislivka. But really, they don't say much, only just give the images on the map of activity there. As we come further down south, again, it's interesting to see how much of a grey zone they are putting around Kreminna. In fact, their grey zone pretty much goes back to Mikivka here, and almost back to these lakes and Turney. And in fact, they say there's activity around Turney and Turska perhaps as well. So that would be way more generous to the Russians than mine. That would put, so just to give you a sense of what the Russian source is saying here, they would say that the grey zone sort of comes back here and pretty much like that. So huge, especially they also not just have a big old grey zone, but the Russian have control right to Dubrova. So their Russian control would actually look like that. the Russian lines. Maybe a bit more generous, maybe sort of like that. So that is quite a different map to mine, but maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't know, but there is fighting around this traditionally big grey zone that's been the case since Liman was liberated. Um, but it's just not a lot of news coming out of there, as Defmon says. There's absolutely no news coming from the Kreminna front. The Ukrainians are keeping a tight lid on information. I get the feeling the Ukrainians have dropped back a bit again, possibly as a result of Russian counterattacks and the Ukrainians repulse an attack around Bilorivka. So yeah, tough fighting around there. In fact, what does no reports say? Chervona-Popivka and Dubrova came under artillery fire. Ukrainians repelled an attack north of Bilorivka. Russians are reporting that Ukrainians are getting active in the area. Also, on the other bank of the Siversky Donetsk River, coming from the forest south of Kreminna. So, yeah, no report says there's activity south of Kreminna, south of the other side of the Siversky Donetsk River, and as well, Chervona-Popivka is getting heavily shelled, and Dubrova. So, again, you might say that's the same as it's been the last few days. Well, quite possibly, it's just not a lot of news coming out of there, which means there could be some heavy activity going on or not. And just also to say that Rebar claimed yet again that the Ukrainians are getting ready for a large scale attack on the Kremlin area. So that appears to be um, a major concern for the Russians there. I mean, they also say that about Zaporizhia. Whether they genuinely think that's the case or not, I don't know. So as we come down south from Kreminna, past Bilorivka, not a lot of news other than a bit of activity north of Bilorivka. We come towards Spirna, Bristova, Bilorivka, this one, and Yakovlivka, and then on to Solidar. Not too much news until we get to Yakovlivka, really, and Solidar. Defmon says it seems that the Russians are targeting the north flank of Bakhmut. Rumors are Solidar will be targeted. There's talk of up to 4 to 5 battalions of VDV. Those are airborne troops being allocated to the Solidar area as operational reserves. Again, interesting because that's not Wagner mercenaries. That is regular, in fact, decent Russian troops. No report says Russian sources claim gains east of Solidar, unconfirmed. South of Pridorodny, no changes. So let's look at the Rebar map. There are some gains from the Russians in Solidar and no gains around Pidorodna. But then if you look at what the Russians say, let's go to northeast of Bakhmut. Wagner fighters took over 2 platoon strongholds near Pidorodna and 7 firing positions northwest of Bakhmut's Solidar line. Now, there's interesting language from Rebar always. Taking hold of 2 platoon strongholds, what does that mean? Does that mean literally 2 buildings, like I said on previous days, and 7 firing positions? Literally, what does that mean? Could that be just someone at a window of a building? That's a firing position. It sounds great, but actually, I'm not trying to minimize this being pro Ukrainian. I'm interested in what really they mean by that. And then you look at language little down here. Wagner assault units are advancing on Solidar from the direction of Bakhmutsk and Yakovlivka. Russian troops are also storming enemy positions in the direction of Radilivka and Vasily. What does, again, storming, that sounds like they've just overrun it. Or does that just mean attacking? Language is important. It tells you things. However, Vasily and Rozdolivka are under pressure. So this is Yakovlivka. This is this area that was taken by the Russians, and I said that is bad news for the Ukrainians. Not only is it a move across this main road, but this is possibly a key that unlocks the north of Bakhmut. Solidar is under an awful lot of pressure. They are making some incremental gains in Solidar, and apparently they are, well, according to Rebar, storming Vasily and Rozdolivka. They are putting pressure on these places, and there are claims that the Ukrainians have mined Vasily, and that's an indication that they are looking to lose Vasily if they've mined it to give issue to the Russian troops who take it over. So yeah, pressure on Rosalivka and Vasily that is not looking good north of Bakhmut, and places according to Rebar have been taken around Pidorodny and Solidar in terms of firing positions and strongholds. Well, Yeah. If we come further down south, not an awful lot of news about what's going on in this eastern area still. I still don't know about this waste sorting plant, and fighting still going on in Opitny. Uh, Defmon, as we come further down south, says, well, actually, he says about the place I just talked about. The Russians are making incremental gains in north of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians repulsed attacks around Dolivka, Bilorivka, Solodar, and Krasnohora. So just to let you know where Krasnohora is, that is tax towards Krasnohora as well. Just unknown as to whether that means down here by the road or actually by Krasnohora. Towards is such a, it does a lot of heavy lifting, that word. So there's fighting around here as you would expect. It's all about the north, it seems, at the moment. As we go further down south, Defmon says Ukrainians repulse attacks around Bakhmut, Klishchivka, and Ozorynivka. I believe this section of the Bakhmut front is fairly stable. Russian units try to cross the canal but get their backsides handed to them by Ukrainian artillery. The canal is not that big of an obstacle, but there is open field. So what he's talking about here is this area, Kodimivka and Ozorynivka, where the Ukrainians had a pop at this entrenchment and cleared it out. That had there were quite a lot of Russian losses there, but they struggled to make gains across the canal because you've got a lot of open fields around here, and the Ukrainian artillery is very active, so it's quite difficult to get across there. It does seem they have, as Deflon says, stabilized to the south. Noel report says around Klishchivka remains the hottest zone. He thinks the south is hotter. I'm not sure. Russia tries to bypass Klishchivka, but until now they've been stopped by the Ukrainians. This is Klishchivka again. I talk about this a lot. It's behind there. There's extensive trench networks. It's going to be very difficult to take because this is on high ground. So this area down here has been difficult for the Russians to really control meaningfully. But they are trying to get a foothold in on the eastern suburbs, northeastern suburbs, if you can call them suburbs, of this village of Klishchivka. So there you go. That's Bakhmut. It's now switched to the north being a real challenge there, and I think that's what we need to look out for in the coming days. So to back up those kind of views that it's more stable in the south, Rebar reporting that the Russian forces repulsed an attack to retake positions in the southeast area, and in the southwest, Russian forces continue their assaults on the Ukrainian stronghold at Klishchivka. Okay, let's move on to Avdivka. There's really not a lot of news coming out of the New York area. It seems to be really quiet around here. We get down to Krasnohorivka. There's some fighting around Krasnohorivka and the usuals for Avdivka, but it again just seems really quite stable in that area, considering how it was for a month or so previously. It's all about Bakhmut now. When it comes to Avdivka, you know, Defmon says really heavily fortified. It doesn't expect this to move at all. It hasn't moved in years. Rebar only mentioned that the Ukrainians are shelling certain areas. So in Luhansk People's Republic, Ukrainian units shelled civilian buildings in all these places with HIMARS. At least 8 civilians were wounded, including a 14-year-old boy. So of course they're going to sell that as an attack on civilians. But no mention of Avdivka, no reports, no mapping, no mention of Avdivka or Marinka. So yeah, just really, really quiet there. What Rebud do say about Marinka, and let's go down there on the map. So not a lot of activity around there. We've got apparently, according to Rebar again, and I chuckle because I said this before, Russian armed forces continue to push the enemy to the western outskirts of Marinka. They're not pushing them to the western outskirts because they're exactly where they were yesterday and the day before and for the previous week. Fighting is going on in the center here, and it continues. Uh, but that's wishful thinking from Rebar. And then as we come further down south, again, really not a lot of activity. We've got Mykolivka and Mikilska. The Ukrainians have tried to do some counterattacks around there. Not sure of the success of that. And then it's really artillery duels sort of going on along this area here until we get to Nikushna, where there has been some fighting there. So we come to the west, going along to the Zaporizhia front line fully in Drozhnyanka. I talked about this place yesterday. The Russians claiming that they had captured it. Not really 100% sure still. I mean, Rebar has claimed again in the Polihi sector, Russian units regained control of Dorozhnyanka. The enemy retreated to reserve lines with losses. I mean, that's interesting because they claimed this yesterday, and if they're claiming today that they've regained control, or today, this being last night, and yesterday being actually the day before. If they claim that they regained it, then they weren't telling the truth the time before. So the enemy retreated to reserve line with losses. A Russian recon group raided Ukrainian positions north of Korovka. Units from the 56th Ukrainian Brigades are planning a counterattack in Beloria Cherivna. So there is activity, sorry, around here. I haven't moved my lines. I just want some confirmation. It's always good to get confirmation from both sides, I guess. Well, always, but sometimes that's not the case for either side. But yeah, certain skirmishes along this line, and then really we come out and it's Kherson and Crimea, and a couple of things to say on those two areas. As you can imagine, very heavy shelling around the Dnipro River into the Kherson, Ukrainian area of the Kherson Oblast. That has been under quite consistent shelling artillery attack for some time. There is an island in the middle of the Dnipro River that the Ukrainians raised a flag on yesterday, and it caused quite a bit of a stir. On the map recently, Russian sources already confirmed fighting on the island, but we didn't want to acknowledge Ukrainian presence there. So that is just north of Holopristan towards Kherson, fighting over a small bit of land in the middle of the Dnipro River. So that's worthy of commentary, I guess. Also claims about, and somewhat unconfirmed, from this guy saying he received info from a local on two suspected Ukrainian strikes on a Arabatska spit, which links Crimea and the Priozerny on the night of the 1st or 2nd of January. The latter was rumored intercepted by air defense, but a huge explosion suspected. Ammo was heard on the spit. Reportedly, no Russian TV or radio since in Henichesk. So yeah, there was. I didn't report this, but there was a huge explosion reported. And let's have a look at exactly where that is. So we zoom out from Kherson, come over to northeastern Crimea, and we have this large spit coming down here, and you can see it's very close to Henichesk. It's always interesting when you see hits happening sort of down here on the southern coast, because you have to wonder exactly what's doing it. Because when you're thinking about HIMARS, you're thinking, well, that's 180 kilometers. That's never going to be HIMARS. And then you start remembering, the Turkish did give um, uh, a GIMLRS, a guided missile multiple launch rocket system that could fire, did have much greater range, but we never really heard anything about that. Could it be that that's being utilized to take a few pot shots? Maybe they don't have too many of them. That's why we only hear about these things every now and again. Were these drone strikes? It could, who knows? But the Ukrainians are able to hit areas that are well within, Russian territory that they might think are pretty safe. And this includes Simferopol and Sevastopol as well. Sevastopol. So, yeah, some claims about hits within Russian occupied territory, but also Russians on the defensive in terms of what they're building. These are trenches being built and mapped out in northern Crimea. I've sort of mentioned this before, but now satellite imagery is starting to show, although it doesn't particularly on that. This is just someone mapping on top of that. These positions were constructed over the past month and are about 10 kilometers from the Kherson Oblast. So yeah, in northern Crimea, they are building their defenses still, obviously worrying about a forthcoming Ukrainian attack at some point. yeah. Anyway, there you go. That's the Frontline update for today. I'm going to do an acronym uh, video later that's going to just be talking about and explaining a lot of the acronyms used in these sorts of videos or in the social media reports you see, or indeed in mainstream media, although they do a fairly decent job of explaining the acronyms. So I'm going to do a video that clears up a few of those acronyms. If you are lacking some knowledge around them, if you know them all already, you can give that one a miss or just watch it because I don't know, you've got nothing better to do. It would be great for you to join me. Thanks for joining me today for this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I will catch you later for a Ukraine War Update Extra.